When love wore an apron, the grand ballroom, the crystal chandelier cast 1,000 dancing lights across the marble floor of the Ashford Estates grand ballroom. It was the kind of place where fortunes were displayed like trophies, where champagne flowed like water, and where people wore their wealth as casually as others wore cotton. Tonight was no different. The annual Ashford Charity Gala had drawn the city's elite: politicians, business moguls, socialites, and old money families whose names were etched into the very foundations of American high society. Marcus Street. James stood near the center of the room, his tailored Tom Ford suit fitting him like a second skin. At 34, he was the youngest partner at Wellington & Cross, one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass, and his smile, when he chose to use it, could charm the most hardened of hearts. But tonight, that smile was reserved, measured, deployed only when necessary as he navigated conversations about stock portfolios, real estate ventures, and political donations. He was engaged to Victoria Ashford, the daughter of Senator James Ashford, a woman who moved through these circles as naturally as breathing. Their engagement had been announced 6 months ago to great fanfare, a union that made perfect sense on paper. Both families approved. Both had Ivy League pedigrees. Both understood the unspoken rules of their world. But Marcus felt hollow. As he stood making small talk with a congressman about tax reform, his eyes wandered across the room. That's when he saw her. She was carrying a silver tray of champagne flutes, weaving gracefully between clusters of guests. Unlike everyone else in the room, she wore a simple black dress with a white apron, the uniform of the catering staff. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her face, though focused on her work, had a natural beauty that needed no enhancement. There was something about the way she moved, a quiet dignity in her posture, that made her stand out even in her service role. She was just passing by when someone bumped into her from behind. The tray tilted. Marcus watched in slow motion as several glasses began to slide. Without thinking, he stepped forward and caught 2 of them before they could fall, his hands moving with surprising speed. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, sir," she said quickly, her eyes wide with worry. "I didn't mean to." "It's not your fault," Marcus said, setting the glasses back on her tray. "Someone pushed past you. Are you all right?" She looked surprised by the question, as if no one in this room had ever asked her that before. Yes, I'm fine. Thank you, sir." "Marcus," he said, extending his hand. "Just Marcus." She hesitated before shaking it, her hand small and warm in his. "Elena," she said softly. "Elena Rodriguez." For a moment, their eyes met, and Marcus felt something shift inside him, a crack in the carefully constructed walls he'd built around himself. There was intelligence in her gaze, kindness, and something else he couldn't quite name. Before he could say anything more, another server called her name, and she excused herself, disappearing back into her role, invisible to most of the room. But not to Marcus. He found his eyes following her throughout the evening, watching the way she smiled politely when guests didn't acknowledge her thanks, the way she gracefully handled the 1,000 small indignities that came with serving people who barely saw her as human. Part 2. The coffee shop. Marcus couldn't explain why he went back to that neighborhood 3 days later. The catering company Elena worked for was based in Queens, and he'd made some discreet inquiries about where their employees typically spent their breaks. He found himself at a small coffee shop on Roosevelt Avenue, the kind of place that was the complete opposite of the Ashford Ballroom. Cramped, loud, filled with the smell of strong coffee and conversation in multiple languages. And there she was, sitting alone at a corner table, reading a worn paperback copy of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, in Spanish. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater, her hair down around her shoulders, and she looked more beautiful than any woman in a designer gown. Marcus ordered a coffee and, heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years, approached her table. Elena, she looked up, recognition flashing across her face, followed immediately by confusion. Marcus, what are you? How did you? May I sit? He asked. She nodded slowly, closing her book. This is strange, she said carefully. Men like you don't usually come to places like this. Men like me, rich men, powerful men, men who wear suits that cost more than I make in a month. There was no bitterness in her voice, just a statement of fact. Marcus sat down, feeling suddenly exposed. I wanted to see you again. Why? It was a simple question, but it held years of lived experience behind it. Experience that had taught her that when people from his world noticed people from hers, it was rarely for good reasons. Because when I met you the other night, you were the only real person in that entire room, Marcus said honestly. And I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. Elena studied him for a long moment. I have to work 2 more catering jobs this week. I share a 1-bedroom apartment with my mother and younger sister in Jackson Heights. I'm taking night classes at Queens College, trying to finish a degree I started 6 years ago before my father got sick. I'm 28 years old, and I have exactly $843 in my savings account. She paused. You're engaged to Victoria Ashford. I looked you up. That's the world you belong to, not this one. What if I don't want that world? The words came out before Marcus could stop them, and he realized as he said them that they were true. Everyone wants that world, Elena said, but her voice had softened. They just don't want to admit it. They talked for 2 hours that day. Elena told him about growing up in Corona, Queens, the daughter of immigrants from El Salvador. Her father had worked in construction until a workplace accident left him disabled. Her mother cleaned houses. Elena had dreamed of becoming a teacher, but life had other plans. She worked 3 jobs now: catering, retail, and occasional tutoring, sending money home while trying to finish her degree 1 class at a time. Marcus talked about his own life in a way he never had before. He spoke about the pressure, the expectations, the feeling of being a chess piece moved around a board he didn't design. He admitted that his engagement to Victoria was more merger than marriage, arranged by families who saw compatibility in shared stock portfolios rather than shared dreams. When they finally left the coffee shop, the sun was setting, painting the Queen's skyline in shades of orange and gold. Marcus walked Elena to the subway station, neither of them wanting the conversation to end. "Can I see you again?" he asked. Elena looked at him with sadness in her eyes. "You know this is a bad idea, right? People like us. We don't get happy endings with people like you. Maybe we could try for a different kind of story," Marcus said. Against her better judgment, Elena smiled. "Maybe." Part 3. The hidden romance. Over the next 3 months, Marcus and Elena existed in a secret world they built between his reality and hers. They met in Queens, far from the eyes of Manhattan's social circles. They ate at small Dominican restaurants where the food was served on plastic plates and tasted better than anything in Michelin-starred establishments. They walked through Flushing Meadows Park, talking about everything and nothing. They went to independent movie theaters in Astoria and held hands in the dark. Marcus learned Spanish from Elena, stumbling over words while she laughed at his pronunciation. She told him stories about her family, about her grandmother who had walked hundreds of miles to give her children a better life, about her father who still believed in the American dream even though it had broken his body. Elena spoke about these struggles without self-pity, but with a quiet strength that made Marcus admire her more with each passing day. Elena learned about Marcus's world too, but not the glossy version everyone saw. She learned about his mother, who had died when he was 12, and how his father had dealt with grief by drowning himself in work and expectations. She learned that Marcus had once wanted to be a public defender, to use law to help people who needed it most, but had been steered toward corporate law by family pressure and student debt. She learned that beneath the expensive suits was a man who felt trapped by his own success. "Why don't you just leave?" Elena asked one evening as they sat on her apartment's fire escape, sharing takeout Chinese food from paper containers. "If you're so unhappy, why not walk away?" Marcus was quiet for a long time. "Because I don't know who I am without all of it," he finally admitted. "Without the firm, without my father's approval, without the life that's been planned for me since I was 18. It's like, if I take off the suit, I'm afraid there might be nothing underneath." Elena set down her chopsticks and took his hand. "There's plenty underneath," she said gently. "I've seen it. A man who tips servers more than their meals cost. Who remembers my sister's name after meeting her once. Who reads the books I recommend even when they're in Spanish and he has to use a dictionary. That man exists, Marcus. He's not the suit." It was that night, on that fire escape in Queens with the sounds of the city rising around them, that Marcus realized he was in love with Elena Rodriguez. Not the careful, measured emotion he'd convinced himself he felt for Victoria, but something raw and real and terrifying. He loved the way Elena saw the world, the way she found joy in small things, the way she fought for her dreams even when the odds were stacked against her. He loved her strength, her kindness, her refusal to be diminished by circumstances she hadn't chosen, but he still hadn't told Victoria the truth. He still went to society dinners and smiled for photos. He still lived his double life, and the weight of the deception was beginning to crush him. Part 4. The unraveling. The end began on a Tuesday evening in late autumn. Marcus was supposed to meet Elena for dinner, but Victoria had insisted he attend a last-minute cocktail party at her parents' estate, the same ballroom where he'd first seen Elena months before. As he stood making conversation with people whose names he could barely remember, he felt his phone vibrate with a text from Elena. "It's okay. We can reschedule. Be safe." The simple kindness of those words, the lack of guilt or pressure, made his chest ache. He looked around at the glittering room, at Victoria holding court with a group of socialites, at his future laid out before him like a prison sentence disguised as privilege, and something in him snapped. He found Victoria in the library, away from the crowd. "We need to talk." She looked at him with the perfectly composed expression she'd been trained to wear since childhood. If this is about the wedding venue, I've already told you. I can't marry you, Marcus said. The words came out quieter than he'd intended, but they carried the weight of months of truth deferred. Victoria's composure flickered for just a moment. Excuse me, I'm in love with someone else, Marcus continued. I have been for months. And I can't keep lying to you, to her, to myself. This engagement, Victoria, we both know it's not about love. It never was. Love. Victoria laughed, a cold sound. You're throwing away everything for love. Marcus, we're adults. Marriage in our world isn't about love. It's about partnership, about building something stable. Love is what you have with a mistress, discreetly, while maintaining the life you've built. I don't want that life, Marcus said. Not anymore. Who is she? Victoria's eyes had gone hard. Some actress. A model trying to climb her way up. Marcus hesitated, knowing what his answer would do. She works in catering. Her name is Elena. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. You're leaving me for the help. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried decades of her class's disdain. Do you have any idea what this will do to your career? To your reputation? My father will destroy you, Marcus. One word from him, and you'll never work in this city again. Then I'll work somewhere else, Marcus said, feeling simultaneously terrified and more free than he'd felt in years. But Victoria's threat wasn't empty. Within a week, Marcus was called into a meeting with the senior partners at his firm. They didn't fire him directly, that would have been too obvious. Instead, they made his position untenable, passing him over for cases, excluding him from meetings, letting him know in 1,000 small ways that his presence was no longer welcome. His father stopped taking his calls. Friends from college suddenly became too busy to meet for drinks. Doors that had always opened for him began to close, one after another. He told Elena everything one rainy evening in her small living room, her mother and sister tactfully giving them privacy. I'm sorry, he said, head in his hands. I'm so sorry for dragging you into this. Elena was quiet for a long time. Are you sorry you told the truth, or sorry about the consequences? The consequences, Marcus admitted. Never the truth. Then we'll figure it out, Elena said, though her voice carried worry she couldn't quite hide. You're smart, talented. You'll find another job. We'll be okay. But Marcus saw the doubt in her eyes, heard it in her voice. He'd gone from being a successful attorney to a cautionary tale, and he'd done it for a relationship that his entire world viewed as impossible. More than that, he'd made Elena visible to people who had preferred not to see her, and he knew that visibility came with its own dangers. Part 5. The price of love. The next 6 months were the hardest of Marcus's life. He found work at a small nonprofit legal clinic in the Bronx, making a fraction of his former salary. The work was meaningful, helping immigrants navigate the legal system, fighting against deportations, representing people who couldn't afford representation, but the adjustment was brutal. He moved out of his expensive Manhattan apartment and into a modest one-bedroom in Astoria, near Elena. His father called once, voice cold with disappointment. You had everything, he said. And you threw it away for what? For a woman you'll be bored within a year. For myself, Marcus replied. I threw it away for myself. But there were moments, late at night, when doubt crept in. When he looked at his dwindling bank account and thought about the life he'd left behind. When he saw Elena working herself to exhaustion, now down to 2 jobs since she'd increased her class load to finally finish her degree. When he realized that loving someone across class lines meant not just losing his world, but struggling to survive in hers. Elena felt the pressure too. She faced whispers at her catering jobs. People who'd read about Marcus's broken engagement in society columns, who looked at her with judgment or pity. Her own mother worried aloud about what would happen if Marcus realized the romance of poverty wore off quickly. Love is beautiful, her mother said in Spanish, but it doesn't pay rent. It doesn't put food on the table. The breaking point came on a cold February evening. Marcus came home to find Elena crying at her small kitchen table, surrounded by bills and paperwork. Her father needed an expensive surgery that their minimal insurance wouldn't fully cover. The family was tens of thousands of dollars short. I can't ask you, Elena said when she saw Marcus. You've already given up so much. Marcus looked at the bills, did the math in his head. He'd been slowly liquidating investments, savings accounts he'd built up from years at the firm. He had just enough. It would leave him with almost nothing, but it would cover the surgery. You're not asking, he said. I'm offering. Elena shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, Marcus, I can't let you do that. You've already lost everything for me. I can't take more. You haven't taken anything, Marcus said, kneeling in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. You've given me everything. You've given me a reason to be the person I always wanted to be but was too afraid to become. You've shown me what courage looks like, what strength looks like. This money, it's just money. But your father's life, your family, that's everything. I never knew my true love would wear an apron, Marcus said, his voice breaking. I thought love was supposed to be easy, supposed to fit into the neat boxes society creates for us. But you've taught me that real love, it's messy and complicated and sometimes it costs everything you have. And it's still worth it. You're still worth it. Elena pulled him close, and they held each other in that tiny kitchen, 2 people from different worlds who'd chosen each other despite the cost. Part 6. The proposal. A year later, Marcus stood in the same grand ballroom where he'd first met Elena. But this time, everything was different. He'd arranged it all carefully, reaching out to old contacts who, despite the scandal, still respected him. Calling in every favor he'd ever earned. The Ashford estate was hosting another charity gala, and Marcus had convinced them to let Elena's catering company handle the event. More than that, he'd convinced them to let him make a speech. Elena moved through the crowd, serving champagne, unaware of what was about to happen. Her father had successfully recovered from his surgery and was back at work in a lighter capacity. Elena was set to graduate from Queen's College the following month. Marcus's work at the legal clinic had earned him recognition in different circles, not the wealthy elite, but people who valued justice over prestige. When the moment came, Marcus took the microphone. The room fell silent. A year ago, he began, his voice steady, I stood in this room and saw nothing but gilded cages. I was engaged to be married, successful by every measure society values, and completely empty inside. Then I met someone who changed everything. He saw Elena stop in her tracks, her tray forgotten, eyes wide with confusion and dawning realization. Her name is Elena Rodriguez, Marcus continued, watching shock ripple through the crowd. She was serving champagne that night, and she showed me more grace and dignity in 5 minutes than I'd shown in my entire privileged life. Over the past year, she's taught me what courage really means. She's taught me that your worth isn't measured by your bank account or your last name. She's taught me that real strength is working 3 jobs to put yourself through school while helping your family survive. That real love means choosing someone every single day, even when that choice costs you everything you thought you wanted. Marcus stepped off the small stage and walked through the parting crowd toward Elena. The room was utterly silent, hundreds of eyes watching this moment unfold. When he reached her, he took the tray from her hands and set it on a nearby table. Then, as cameras flashed and society gasped, he dropped to one knee. "Elena Rodriguez," he said, pulling out a simple ring, not a massive diamond like the one he'd given Victoria, but a beautiful sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, bought with money he'd earned at the clinic. "You are my true love. The woman who wears an apron but carries more dignity than anyone in designer clothes. You've made me a better man. You've made me a real man. Will you marry me?" Elena looked down at him, tears streaming down her face. Around them, the ballroom held its collective breath. This wasn't how their story was supposed to go. The prince didn't actually marry Cinderella. The rich man didn't genuinely choose the poor girl. That only happened in fairy tales. But sometimes, real life surprises us. "Yes," Elena whispered, then louder, "yes." Marcus slipped the ring on her finger and stood, pulling her into his arms. The room erupted, not in applause, but in shocked murmurs, in disbelief, in scandal. But neither of them cared. They had each other, and they had the truth. Epilogue. The real ending 6 months later. They married in a small ceremony in Corona, Queens, surrounded by Elena's large extended family and a handful of Marcus's colleagues from the clinic. No senator attended. No society pages covered it. But it was real, filled with joy and salsa music and food that actually tasted like love. They struggled. Even with 2 incomes, New York City was expensive, and they were building a life without the safety net Marcus had once taken for granted. But they struggled together, and that made all the difference. Marcus built a reputation as a fierce advocate for immigrants' rights. Elena finished her degree and got a job teaching at a public elementary school in Queens, finally achieving the dream she'd deferred for so long. They lived in a small apartment, took the subway everywhere, and counted every dollar, and they were happy. Genuinely, deeply happy in a way that had nothing to do with what they owned and everything to do with who they'd chosen to become. Both separately and together. Because Marcus had been right that night when he'd made his confession on the ballroom floor. He never knew his true love would wear an apron. He'd thought love would look like him, come from his world, speak his language. Instead, it looked like a woman with calloused hands from hard work, whose strength came not from privilege but from survival, whose beauty came not from expensive treatments but from a generous spirit. Some people from Marcus's old world said he threw everything away. But those people never understood that he hadn't thrown anything away. He'd let go of what was slowly killing him and grabbed hold of what made him feel alive. And on quiet Sunday mornings, When he and Elena sat on their fire-escape drinking coffee and watching queens come to life, Marcus knew with absolute certainty. This was everything. This was what it meant to find your true love, even when she wore an apron. Especially because she wore it with such dignity and grace that it might as well have been a crown.